As I sat there, nursing my drink, my mind refused to settle. The last few weeks had felt like a blur, but the unease had been growing, gnawing at me, and it wouldn't quit. Emily was hiding something, I was sure of it. It wasn't just one thing, either. It was every little moment, every strange behavior that had stacked up, weighing on me, driving my gut into knots. I couldn't pinpoint anything specific, though. No evidence, no names, no solid proof. Just a sense that everything was wrong. And that uncertainty. It was messing with my head, making me doubt everything, even myself. Was I imagining it all? Or had she already crossed a line I couldn't see? But my instincts wouldn't let it go. I'd been chewing on these thoughts for what felt like forever, trying to piece together what was happening right under my nose. Was it just a fling? Or was it something more? Every time I thought about it, I felt like I was drowning in my own suspicions. And yet, there I was, no closer to the truth. I took another slow sip of my whiskey, the burn in my throat barely cutting through the frustration. The bartender caught my eye and gave me a knowing look, a look that said he'd seen this kind of trouble 1,000 times before. But this time, it was happening to me. And that's when I realized, everything was about to change. I just didn't know how deep the betrayal went. Not yet. The bar was almost silent, with low murmurs blending into the background, and the mood inside was just as bleak as the storm outside. The people around me all had these blank expressions, like they were just waiting out the rain before heading back home. There was this woman there, dressed way too nice for this place, clearly craving attention as she accepted drinks from an older guy who seemed hopeful, though he probably didn't need to try that hard, she was already into him. The rest of the folks were just passing time, waiting for a reason to leave. I was still sitting there, trying to figure out what to do next, when I heard a voice behind me. Turning around, I saw Rachel standing there, her eyes cutting right through me like she could see straight into my thoughts. When I tried to speak, the words just wouldn't come out. In the dim light, with her coat dripping from the rain, she started to take it off, and I couldn't help but wonder why she was here. So, I asked her. She said she was worried about me, had a feeling she'd find me at this bar. She suggested we sit down and talk. I stared at her, trying to figure out her angle and whether or not I could trust her. I needed a moment to steady myself, so I took another swig of my drink and ordered her a vodka and soda. We waited until the bartender wandered off before continuing the conversation. Our eyes met, both of us unsure, quietly trying to take control of the situation. Rachel pointed out that she'd noticed I'd been carrying something heavy lately, like I was holding on to a burden too big for me to bear. I held her gaze for a moment, but then I looked away. There was something between us, something unspoken, but I wasn't ready to acknowledge it. I told her everything was fine, trying to brush it off like it was nothing, but she didn't believe me. My heart sank as I realized that no matter how hard I tried to hide it, she could see right through me. She set her glass down, laced her fingers together, and leaned in a little closer. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She told me she knew exactly what was going on. I tried to play it off, acting clueless like I didn't have the faintest idea what she meant, but Rachel wasn't having it. She suggested we move to a booth for some privacy, and while I wasn't too keen on the idea, I followed her lead. Once we were sitting down, I asked her what she thought she knew, hoping to steer the conversation in another direction. But Rachel wasn't fooled by my attempt to dodge the topic. She reminded me that after everything we'd been through, I couldn't lie to her. And she was right. I had known Rachel since she was 17, back when I first started dating Emily. She'd always been around, and at one point, she even had a crush on me, though in the end, I married her sister. As the years passed, Emily and I tied the knot and built what I thought was the perfect life. We both had decent jobs, made enough money to live comfortably, and to the outside world, everything seemed to be just fine. Meanwhile, Rachel had grown into a beautiful, confident woman. By the time she reached her mid-20s, she was the kind of woman any guy would feel lucky to know, let alone be close to. But sitting across from her now in that bar, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that my marriage, which was coming up on its 5-year anniversary, might not survive to see the 6th. Rachel, with concern in her eyes, could see the pain I was trying so hard to bury. Before I could stop myself, I felt my heart shatter as she spoke the words I had been desperately avoiding. She told me, flat out, that she believed Emily was cheating on me. My mind went blank for a second as I tried to process her words. I didn't want to hear it, and I definitely didn't want to believe it. I figured if I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe if I just ignored all the signs, I could avoid the heartbreak that came with facing the truth. Rachel must have picked up on my vacant expression because she asked if I was in shock or simply in denial. She said she loved me and was genuinely worried that I wasn't seeing the situation clearly. Part of her even hoped it was all just one big misunderstanding. But I kept brushing her off, stubbornly clinging to the lie I was telling myself. Rachel's frustration finally boiled over, her eyes flashing with anger, catching the attention of the bartender. I quickly assured him that everything was fine, and Rachel apologized for causing a scene. She wasn't mad at me, she was upset because she cared. She wanted me to wake up, to see the situation for what it was. She said we needed to do something about it, and reluctantly, I agreed to listen. That's when she started telling me about an incident from a few weeks back, when she was hanging out with Emily. Apparently, Emily got a call and stepped out of the room to take it. That struck Rachel as strange, since they were sisters and typically shared everything with each other. I nodded, that familiar pit of dread forming in my stomach. Rachel continued, explaining that later. She had checked Emily's phone and noticed there wasn't even a lock code on it. The call had come from someone listed as David, but Rachel had no clue who this guy was. So, she decided to keep an eye on things, waiting to see if something would happen again. About a week later, Rachel finally pieced together who David was. He was someone from Emily's past, a guy she had known long before I ever came into the picture. They had reconnected recently, probably through social media or some chat app, and had been messaging each other for weeks. I told Rachel that I hadn't noticed anything like that going on, but I had felt this growing distance between Emily and me lately. Rachel nodded, acknowledging that while my concerns were valid, Emily and this guy weren't doing anything obvious, just little things that, when put together, felt all too convenient. I asked if it could be as simple as two old friends catching up through messages, but Rachel shook her head, saying it had gone further than that. Her response hit me hard, so I pressed her, asking if I'd somehow missed all the signs that were right in front of me. I explained how, lately, everything between Emily and me seemed to be working against us, leaving no room for connection or fun. Rachel stared at me, disbelief all over her face. "You've got to stop burying your head in the sand," she said, reminding me how much she cared about me. I pushed for more, desperate to understand how bad things really were. The look in her eyes was enough to tell me the truth, and that flicker of reality lit a slow-burning rage deep inside me. I immediately demanded to know the details, when, how, and where these meetups had taken place. Rachel told me that Emily had met up with this guy at least 3 times over the last couple of weeks. At first, she wasn't entirely sure, but 2 days ago, during lunch with a friend who worked with Emily, some crucial information slipped out. Her friend casually mentioned that Emily had met the guy twice for lunch and once for dinner just last week. Rachel asked if any of that lined up with things I'd noticed. As I thought about it, a couple of moments came to mind. There had been a few times recently when I'd called Emily's office to meet for lunch, only to be told she wasn't there or had already gone out. Was that when she was seeing him? Then there was that seminar she'd mentioned last week, a last-minute work event that supposedly ran late. She hadn't gotten home until after midnight, claiming the seminar dragged on, and afterward, the team grabbed a drink at the hotel bar to unwind. I remembered there hadn't been any intimacy that night. She went straight to the shower, then straight to bed. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. Seeing how shaken I was, Rachel warned me not to act recklessly, reminding me that I didn't want to do something I'd regret or that could land me in any kind of legal trouble. But I'd already made up my mind. My expression must have said it all because Rachel's face filled with worry as I firmly declared that I wasn't going to let this continue any longer. I told Rachel flat out that I wasn't going to stand for a cheating partner and swore that both Emily and this other guy would pay for what they'd done. Rachel urged me to slow down, warning me not to act rashly without thinking things through. Oddly enough, her calm tone had a way of easing my anger, grounding me in what I already knew deep down. My suspicions were real. I asked if she had any idea where Emily was at that moment, and Rachel said she was probably with him. That's the whole reason she had come to find me. Her answer made my blood boil, and I slammed my fist on the table, drawing the attention of a few nearby patrons. I waved off the bartender, then turned back to Rachel. "Do you know where they are right now?" I asked, my voice trembling with fury. She didn't know the exact spot but promised she'd talk to Emily tomorrow and try to gather more information. Apparently, the guy was married with kids, but Rachel wasn't sure where he lived. She promised to find out what she could and help me. I reached across the table and took her hand, gripping it tightly as I wiped a tear from her cheek. "Thank you," I whispered, grateful for her support even though it felt strange. Rachel looked at me with concern, asking what I planned to do next. I reassured her I wouldn't act on pure impulse, at least not yet, but I was dead set on ending this. I told her there would be no forgiveness for either of them. I was going to make sure they paid for their betrayal. In the meantime, I knew I had to protect what was mine and start gathering proof. I downed the last of my Jack, motioned for the bartender, and left him a tip. Rachel still looked uneasy as she asked when I planned to confront Emily. I thought for a moment, telling her I'd make a few calls tomorrow to start securing my assets. I made it clear I wasn't going to let Emily walk away with a single penny of mine. Rachel pointed out how hard it must be to live with her while knowing all of this, and I admitted the past few weeks had been pure hell. If Emily hadn't noticed the growing distance by now, she probably never would. Rachel stood to leave, saying we should talk again tomorrow. I agreed, and she promised to dig up more details for me. As she slipped on her coat, I helped her, and for a brief moment, standing so close, she looked so much like Emily. Tears welled up in her eyes as she gazed at me, and I kissed her softly on the cheek, telling her I'd be all right. She gave me a small smile before disappearing into the rain-soaked night. I sat back down, taking a deep breath, and began plotting my next move. One thing was certain, there was no way they were getting away with this. My revenge would be swift, cold, and merciless. After that, things became a blur. Somehow, I found myself waking up in my own bed the next morning. My mouth was dry, and my head pounded like a drum. I rolled over to see that Emily was already gone, though I could hear faint noises drifting up from downstairs. Swinging my legs over the edge of the bed, I stood up, trying to shake off the hangover. As I stumbled into the bathroom, my mind raced with thoughts of last night and everything that was coming next. Entering the kitchen, I found Emily already there. She gave me a quick glance, eyeing me up and down before casually asking what kind of state I was in. I muttered something vague about catching up with an old friend and having a few too many. Grabbing a glass, I filled it with orange juice, downed it in one gulp, then poured another. She wasn't satisfied with my answer and pressed for more details, asking who the friend was. That's when it hit me, I needed a cover story. So, I mentioned a guy named Mike, an old college buddy who was in town for business. At the mention of the name Mike, I saw the tiniest flicker of recognition cross her face before she quickly turned away. I kept talking, filling in the story with bits about us playing football back in the day. Emily acted like she didn't remember him, but brushed it off, saying it didn't matter as long as I had a good time. That was my first warning sign. As she sat across from me, I couldn't help but notice how distant she seemed, like she wasn't fully present. I casually brought up her evening, trying to sound uninterested, though I watched her closely. She told me she'd finished work and grabbed a quick bite and drink with some coworkers, getting home around 9:30. But I knew better. I had been home until 10 before heading to the bar. That was the second glaring red flag. She continued on, talking about her plans for the day, mentioning she might be home late again. Then, almost like it was nothing, she mentioned that Mike, an old friend of hers, was supposed to get in touch. I forced a smile and suggested she invite him over so we could all catch up together. She hesitated for just a second, then agreed, asking if I really remembered Mike. Her tone was casual, but something beneath the surface didn't sit right with me. I reassured her I was fine and that I could handle it. My mind was already spinning with the next steps in my plan. After finishing my juice, I popped a couple of painkillers and told her I needed to get ready for the day. As I left the house, one thing was crystal clear: this wasn't over. Emily and her lover had no idea what was coming their way. As I got dressed, my resolve only grew stronger. This game had dragged on long enough. The thought of her being with Mike ignited a rage deep inside me, and with each passing minute, my thirst for revenge grew more intense. My anger toward this man I barely knew was rapidly consuming me. The workday was a blur, a constant stream of phone calls, meetings, and problems that wouldn't quit. My secretary took care of some calls, but there were too many pressing matters I couldn't avoid. Despite the chaos of the day, the tension inside me kept rising, fueled by that burning need for payback. By mid-morning, the pace finally slowed, giving me a few moments to focus on my own affairs. I shut my office door and got to work on my finances. Within 15 minutes, I had secured everything, moving funds out of reach, tightening my grip on our joint account. I even scheduled a meeting with a lawyer to go over the logistics of a divorce. Though I had a few days to gather more solid evidence, I doubted it would even matter in the end. Emily had her own accounts, but the joint one was my priority, and now it was safely locked down. My personal finances were secure, and with no kids in the picture, the divorce would be relatively simple if it came to that. I realized there was only one path forward: Emily would have to come clean and beg for forgiveness if there was any chance of salvaging this. But deep down, I wasn't sure forgiveness was even possible. If she hesitated even for a second, we were done. The weight of that realization hit me hard, settling over me like a heavy stone. It saddened me, but there was no turning back now. I sat quietly at my desk, thinking about everything that had unfolded and all the steps I'd taken so far. But I needed more information on Mike, more proof. Or maybe just knowing the truth was enough to tear them down. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was Rachel. I told her I was busy with some plans but that I'd already taken measures to protect myself. She filled me in on more details about Mike Jackson, including the fact that he was married. She'd even gotten his home address and place of work, thanks to a friend who had spotted him with Emily. According to Rachel, things between them were escalating, even though they were doing their best to keep things quiet. Feeling like I finally had something solid to work with, I asked her for all the details on Mike. In no time, I found his social media profile and stared at his picture. There was something unsettlingly familiar about his face, a memory I couldn't quite place. I decided it was time to stir things up, so I called Emily around lunchtime. During the conversation, she casually mentioned she had a meeting with a client named Mr. Jackson. Hearing his name felt like a slap in the face, a twisted reminder of what was going on behind my back. I held back my emotions, keeping the conversation light, though inside, I was burning with rage. Strike 3, I thought, making up my mind that swift, ruthless action was the only way forward. After hanging up, I sat there for a moment, gripping the edge of my desk, my teeth clenched in fury. I promised her I'd see her later, barely able to stomach her saying, "I love you." My secretary walked in, asking if I wanted anything from the deli down the street. Without even looking up, I told her to bring me something heavy on red meat, something I could really tear into. She gave me a curious glance but didn't push, closing the door behind her. She'd noticed my odd behavior all morning, probably sensing that something dark was simmering just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Rachel was conducting her own little investigation. She swung by Emily's office and saw her stepping out of the elevator with a tall, dark-haired man, none other than Mike Jackson. Rachel wasted no time and casually confronted them, asking Mike how long he'd known Emily. Caught completely off guard, he stammered, while Emily quickly pulled him aside, saying they had a meeting to get to. They hurried outside and into a waiting cab, but not before Emily shot a nervous glance back at Rachel. Back in my office, I slowly chewed on the massive sub my secretary brought me, savoring each bite of red meat as I mulled over my next steps. Rachel called again, confirming that Emily had left the office, and a quick call to her secretary confirmed she wouldn't be back for the rest of the afternoon. My finances were secured, and I had a locksmith ready to change the locks at a moment's notice. My lawyer was on standby, just waiting for the final pieces to fall into place. Tonight would be the first move in my plan. I wasn't going to reveal my hand right away, not yet. I wanted to toy with them a bit before I made my final move. My dad always used to say, never let them see you coming, just go straight for the kill. Maybe I'd forgotten that advice for a while, but I was ready to change that now. That evening, Emily walked through the door, looking just like she always did, as if everything was perfectly normal. It all seemed routine until I caught a faint whiff of men's cologne clinging to her clothes. As I leaned in to give her a kiss, she noticed my hesitation. Without a word, I gave her a light peck on the cheek and headed for the door. She called after me, asking if everything was okay and what my plans were for the night. I reassured her I was fine, casually mentioning I had a poker game with some colleagues from work, hoping that would be enough to keep her off my trail. Once I was outside, I got into my car, grinding my teeth as I pulled out of the driveway, my mind racing with everything I had set in motion. I headed over to Dan's place, thoughts swirling about what we were going to do. Dan was a longtime friend, someone I could count on no matter what. He'd had a rough history with the law and plenty of combat training, which made him the perfect person to bring into this situation. When I called him earlier, there had been no hesitation. No questions, just pure loyalty. That's exactly what I needed. When I arrived at his place, we went straight to the garage. There, I changed into a pair of dark overalls and pulled on a ski mask. We looked like a couple of silent mime artists, not saying a word as we climbed into an old, beat-up car Dan had picked up months ago, the kind of car nobody would give a second glance. We drove across town, heading toward the address Rachel had given me. There was no need for conversation, we had already gone over the plan. Dan parked outside Mike Jackson's house, and we waited in silence. The house was dark, save for one small light inside. Eventually, the front door creaked open, and Mike stepped out. He got into his car and drove away. We followed him from a distance, no rush, since we knew exactly where he was heading. When we arrived at the driving range, we parked in the shadows and watched. The parking lot gradually emptied until only a few cars were left. My anger bubbled under the surface, making it hard to stay still. Every part of me wanted to go in there and confront him, but I knew it wasn't the right time. So we waited. As Mike made his way back to his car, Dan slipped out of our vehicle, moving with the kind of practiced stealth that came naturally to him. Once the job was done, I quietly drove us out of the parking lot, doing everything I could not to attract attention. Dan peeled off his gloves and removed his mask, casually mentioning how smoothly everything had gone. I thanked him, genuinely appreciating his help. Dan just shrugged it off, saying he still owed me big time and could never fully repay me for what I'd done for him in the past. I reminded him that we were friends, and friends look out for each other. At least, I added, his hands were clean and there were no security cameras around to complicate things. Feeling satisfied with how the night had unfolded, we decided to head back. Dan suggested we join the guys for the poker game, they were probably already at his place by now. We spent the next 4 hours playing cards, the mood light and supportive, a temporary reprieve from everything that had been set in motion. The guys could tell something was off with me, but they didn't push. Instead, they offered the kind of silent support that gave me a boost of confidence for what was coming next with Emily. But before I confronted her, I had a few tricks up my sleeve to mess with her head. I stumbled through the front door just after 1 a.m., making sure to act a little more drunk than I actually was. Dan had one of the guys drop me off in my car to complete the charade. Emily, who had stayed up waiting for me, was immediately suspicious. Her eyes narrowed as she questioned why I was so late. I waved off her concern, slurring slightly as I told her that Dan and the guys had dropped me off after I'd had too much Jack Daniels. I barely managed to hang my jacket on the peg, completely missing it, before collapsing onto the sofa. Emily sat across from me, arms crossed, disgust written all over her face. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for her to speak. It didn't take long. "What's going on with you, Eric? Is there someone else? You've been acting really weird lately." Anger surged inside me, but I forced a chuckle, reminding myself to stay calm. "I'm fine," I said, keeping my tone light. "Just going through a rough patch. But don't worry, it'll all be over soon." My words hung in the air, unsettling her. She could sense something was off but had no idea what. We went to bed, and I immediately pretended to pass out, faking sleep. I knew she was itching for a confrontation, but I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Not yet. The next morning, she was up first, making coffee. I dragged myself downstairs, putting on a show of being hungover, playing the obnoxious husband. I greeted her with a forced, playful smile and rubbed my temples, mentioning my pounding headache. She tossed me some headache medicine without much interest. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed her phone sitting on the kitchen table. I could feel her tension. She wanted to grab it but didn't want to appear suspicious. I poured myself some orange juice and casually picked up her phone, pretending to move it out of the way. A flash of panic crossed her face as I glanced at the screen, an incoming message lighting up. Handing it back to her, I said, "Looks like your battery's low. You wouldn't want to miss any important messages." Then I walked out of the kitchen without another word, heading upstairs to get dressed. Emily stood there, visibly rattled, trying to figure out if I knew something or if I was still in the dark. She thought she'd been careful. After all, the affair had only been going on for a few weeks, just a couple of lunches, dinners, and 3 hotel stays. To her, it was harmless fun, something she was sure I'd never find out about. After all, she didn't think I was lacking anything at home. As I rushed downstairs, I dodged Emily's attempt at a more intimate goodbye, slipping out the door with a quick wave and a forced smile. I headed off to work, eager to set more of my plan into motion. Around 11 a.m., I decided to stir things up a little more, sending her a text that read, "Sorry I've been distant lately. I've had a lot on my mind, but I promise you everything will be sorted out soon." I leaned back, waiting to see how she'd respond to my text. Later that day, Rachel stopped by my office, her face full of concern. She wanted to know what had happened, especially regarding Mike. I played dumb at first, pushing her to reveal more. Apparently, that morning, someone at the golf club had found Mike Jackson in the trunk of his car, badly beaten. Emily had confided in Rachel, clearly shaken by the news. Rachel looked me dead in the eye and asked if I had anything to do with it. I shrugged it off, acting indifferent, and denied any involvement. I explained that Emily had mentioned Mike's condition during a work-related call, where she'd been informed that he was hospitalized. His wife had confirmed it. Rachel seemed to buy my explanation, but she warned me that next time, things might not be as easy for them. When she asked what I meant by that, I just smiled and said, "Accidents happen in the strangest places." That evening, when I got home, Emily wasn't there, and her car was missing from the driveway. Feeling a surge of irritation, I called her, keeping my tone cheerful, and asked where she was. She told me she was at the hospital visiting a friend but promised she wouldn't be long. I wished her friend a speedy recovery and hung up before she could respond. About half an hour later, Emily walked through the door, looking worn out. I casually asked her about her friend, hoping it wasn't anything too serious. She hesitated for a second, then said it wasn't a big deal, just a minor accident, and her friend would be home soon. Her voice was shaky, like she was trying to keep herself together, but it was clear something had rattled her. I offered to make coffee, and she, looking a bit more relaxed, thanked me. As we sipped our drinks, Emily mentioned offhand that one of her company reps had been attacked recently. Feigning surprise, I asked for more details. She explained that Mike had been assaulted and left in his car overnight, but reassured me he wasn't seriously hurt. She speculated that the attackers had only meant to scare him, since nothing was stolen. I struggled to keep a straight face, knowing how my earlier denial about Mike was now making things more complicated. Emily must have noticed my skepticism because her face tightened as she realized she might have said too much. She quickly tried to change the subject, but it was too late, I'd already connected the dots. She hurriedly left the room, likely to make a phone call. It was clear to me now that things were escalating fast, and I needed to act. Calling out to her, I told Emily I needed to step out for a bit and wouldn't be long. Without waiting for her reply, I got in my car and drove straight to Mike Jackson's house. When I knocked on the door, a petite, dark-haired woman answered. I introduced myself as Eric Turner and calmly told her that my wife, Emily, had been having an affair with her husband. Her face went pale immediately, and though she was visibly shaken, she invited me inside. We sat down in the living room, and I laid everything out for her. I apologized for being the bearer of bad news but told her I thought she had the right to know what was going on. I also mentioned that Mike was currently in the hospital. At that, she broke down, confirming what she had suspected for a while. She confessed she'd known for some time that Mike was cheating again but hadn't been able to prove it until now. She was done with his lies, fed up beyond words, and told me she was going to file for divorce, no questions asked. She wasn't sure how long the affair with Emily had been going on, but there was no doubt in her mind that my wife was involved. When I asked her about the recent attack on Mike, she admitted she had no idea who could have been behind it. I clarified that I had nothing to do with it, but truthfully, I wasn't sorry it had happened. We speculated for a while about whether Mike might have gotten himself mixed up with someone else's wife. Her bitter response, "Nothing surprises me anymore," said it all. She explained they had moved back to the area because of Mike's past infidelities, hoping for a fresh start, but it was obvious now that he hadn't changed. Before I left, I gave her the contact information for my locksmith and solicitor, figuring she would need them soon enough. As I drove home, my mind was razor-focused on what needed to be done next. The anger inside me was sharp and controlled, fueling my need for a thorough and satisfying revenge. The end of my marriage weighed heavily on me, but there was no turning back now. Emily had betrayed me, and there would be no forgiveness. The only comfort I found was knowing that the pain she caused me would eventually come back to haunt her. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Emily's car parked in its usual spot. Tapping the hood absent-mindedly, I realized that this might be the last time I walked through that door as a married man. Each step toward the house felt heavier than the last, like the weight of all that had happened was pressing down on me. I entered and could feel the tension in the air, the recent events hanging between us like a thick fog. The television hummed softly in the background as I approached the living room. Emily sat on the sofa, her entire posture tense, her body language betraying her unease. It was as if she knew everything was about to come crashing down. She sat stiffly, her eyes trembling as they met mine, struggling to keep her composure. I stood there, silently staring at her, letting her squirm under the weight of my gaze. The panic behind her eyes was unmistakable. Her mouth opened as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. Without a word, I walked past her and headed straight for the liquor cabinet. I poured myself a stiff drink, never breaking eye contact with her. Emily sensed the shift in the air but couldn't read my expression. The tension between us hung like a thread about to snap. As I took a slow sip of my drink, I could see her unease deepening. Emily sat up straighter, clearly trying to pull herself together, to take back some sense of control. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice tinged with frustration as she asked where I had been. I stared at her blankly for a moment, then replied that I'd tell her if she first told me where she had been. Her eyes darted nervously, and she stammered that she had been at the hospital with a friend. I held her gaze, letting her lie hang in the air between us, watching her squirm. She tried to shift the conversation back to me, but I cut her off, no longer willing to play along with the charade. I met someone today, I said, taking another slow sip. Someone new, but they've quickly become a close friend. I casually dropped the name, Mike Jackson. I watched as all the color drained from her face, leaving her ghostly pale. I could see the gears turning in her mind, scrambling to figure out just how much I knew. Feigning concern, Emily asked if I was all right and offered to get me another drink. I ignored the attempt at distraction and pressed her further, asking her directly about Mike, letting her feel the full weight of her lies. Then, calmly and deliberately, I laid it all out. I told her I had known about her affair with Mike for some time. She immediately tried to downplay it, insisting it was nothing serious, just a meaningless fling. I scoffed at her pathetic excuses, reminding her of the vows we made and telling her how furious I was for being played like a fool. She apologized, saying it didn't mean anything, and promised she would make it up to me. I laughed bitterly. "You're not sorry for what you did," I said, "you're only sorry because you got caught." I demanded to know if she would have ever stopped if I hadn't found out. The truth was plain on her face, she wouldn't have. She had no intention of stopping. I told her that her lies had become second nature, that she wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with anymore. As my words sank in, I could see her confidence crumble. She begged, desperately asking what she could do to fix things, promising she'd do anything. But I had already made up my mind. "It's too late," I said, my voice cold. "We're done." I called Rachel, explaining the situation and asking her to come over to help Emily pack. Emily, still in shock, asked where she was supposed to go. I told her bluntly that she could go anywhere, even back to her lover at the hospital, for all I cared. When Rachel arrived, she didn't hesitate. She quickly packed Emily's belongings into a couple of suitcases while I stood by, watching the woman I once loved being ushered out of my life. Despite everything, a part of me still wanted to make sure she left safely, but that was the last shred of care I could muster for her. There would be no second chances, no coming back into my life. Emily was gone, and I knew there was no turning back.